Oakwood Elementary School's cafeteria hummed with the daily chaos of 400 hungry children. But all eyes were on the woman behind the serving line, who they'd dismissed as just the lunch lady. What none of them knew was that Diana Blake's steady hands had once held something far deadlier than a serving spoon, and that the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve would soon change everything they thought they knew about heroism. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diana Blake moved through the cafeteria line with mechanical precision, her weathered hands ladling mashed potatoes and green beans onto plastic trays with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained for 3 years. At 34, she carried herself with a posture that suggested military training, though nobody at Oakwood Elementary had ever bothered to ask about her background. To them, she was invisible labor, the woman who fed their children and cleaned up their messes. "Next," she said quietly to a fidgety second grader, her voice carrying no warmth but no hostility either, just professional distance, the kind that came from years of learning that engagement led to questions, and questions led to complications she couldn't afford. Mrs. Helen Wright, the cafeteria supervisor, watched Diana from across the kitchen with barely concealed irritation. At 58, Helen had run this cafeteria for 15 years and prided herself on maintaining proper hierarchy. Diana's quiet competence threatened that hierarchy in ways Helen couldn't articulate but deeply resented. "Blake," Helen called sharply, her voice cutting through the lunchtime noise. "Table 7 needs cleaning. Again." Diana nodded without looking up, finishing her serving duties before grabbing a spray bottle and cloth. Table 7 sat 8 rowdy fourth graders who'd apparently decided their lunch tray was better used as art supplies than eating utensils. Mashed potatoes decorated the table surface, while chocolate milk dripped steadily onto the floor. "Gross," muttered one of the kids as Diana approached. "The lunch lady's gonna yell at us." "She never yells," another corrected. "She's like a robot, just clean stuff." Diana began wiping down the table methodically, her movements efficient and thorough. The children scattered to playground duty, leaving behind their mess without apology or acknowledgement. This was her reality, invisible service to people who saw her as furniture with hands. Frank Delacroix, the school's head janitor, approached with his cart of cleaning supplies. At 45, Frank had worked maintenance jobs his entire adult life and recognized something familiar in Diana's bearing. Military discipline left marks that civilian jobs couldn't erase. "Rough crowd today," he commented, gesturing at the destroyed table. "They're kids," Diana replied simply, not pausing in her cleaning routine. "Kids make messes." Frank studied her face, noting the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, not looking for trouble, but automatically assessing threats and exits. He'd seen that hypervigilance in his brother, who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan. "You ever work anywhere besides schools?" he asked carefully. Diana's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. The conversation ended there, as it always did. Diana had perfected the art of deflecting personal questions without seeming rude. 3 years of practice had taught her exactly how much engagement was required to avoid suspicion while preventing deeper inquiry. Principal Robert Hayes entered the cafeteria during the tail end of lunch service, his expensive suit and confident stride marking him as someone accustomed to authority. At 52, Hayes had built his reputation on running an efficient school where problems were solved quickly and quietly. "Mrs. Wright," he called, approaching the serving line, "I need to discuss the upcoming budget meeting. Are we maintaining our food cost targets?" Helen straightened, eager to demonstrate her management skills. "Absolutely, Principal Hayes. We've reduced waste by 12% this quarter through better portion control and inventory management." Hayes nodded approvingly, his gaze sweeping past Diana as she were part of the equipment. This was standard procedure. Administrators talked about cafeteria workers, not to them. They were numbers on budget spreadsheets, not people with histories or capabilities. Diana continued cleaning, but her trained ears caught every word of their conversation. Budget cuts, efficiency metrics, staff reduction possibilities, the language of institutional indifference spoken by people who never wondered where their food came from or who prepared it.
Jessica Park, a first-year teacher fresh out of college, entered the cafeteria looking frazzled. At 23, she still believed education could change the world, though 3 months of reality were testing that optimism. She approached the serving line hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said to Diana. "I'm sorry to bother you, but little Ashley Cooper in my class said she forgot her lunch money again. Is there any way—" "I'll handle it," Diana interrupted gently, reaching under the counter for a pre-made sandwich. "She's covered." Jessica blinked in surprise. "Oh, that's so kind! How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Diana replied, already turning away. "Kid needs to eat." This had been happening more frequently lately. Diana had started paying for students' meals out of her own minimum wage salary, creating a quiet safety net for children whose families struggled with basic necessities. She kept careful mental notes: which kids came to school hungry, which ones wore the same clothes too many days in a row, which ones carried the subtle signs of homes under stress. Kevin Walsh, a fifth-grade teacher with 20 years of experience, overheard the exchange and shook his head disapprovingly. At 48, Kevin had grown cynical about both his students and his colleagues, viewing kindness as weakness in a system that demanded efficiency. "You can't enable these families," he said loud enough for several people to hear. "If parents can't afford lunch money, that's a social services issue, not a cafeteria issue." Diana said nothing, but Frank noticed her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Military discipline again, controlling emotional responses under pressure. The lunch period ended with the usual chaos of children dumping trays and rushing toward recess. Diana began the systematic process of cleaning and resetting for the next day's service, washing industrial-sized pots, sanitizing surfaces, taking inventory of supplies, manual labor that required no explanation or justification. Helen Wright approached with a clipboard and her trademark expression of barely controlled irritation. "Blake, we need to talk about your uniform. The sleeves on your shirt are too long. Health department regulations require exposed forearms in food service." Diana glanced down to her long-sleeved shirt, one of several she rotated through her wardrobe specifically to keep her arms covered. "I'll adjust tomorrow." "No, you'll adjust now. There's a spare short-sleeved uniform in the office. Change immediately." The command carried the weight of hierarchical authority, delivered by someone who'd found a small piece of power and wielded it with unnecessary force. Diana understood the dynamic. Helen needed to demonstrate control, and the cafeteria staff were the only people she could safely dominate. "Yes, ma'am," Diana replied, heading toward the office. In the small administrative space behind the kitchen, Diana found the spare uniform hanging on a hook. She glanced around, confirming she was alone, then reluctantly began changing shirts. For 3 years, she'd successfully avoided this moment, but Helen's petty authority had finally cornered her. The new shirt fit properly but left her forearms exposed for the first time since she'd started working at Oakwood Elementary. Diana rolled up her sleeves and returned to the kitchen, where her transformation from invisible worker to something else entirely was about to begin. Frank noticed it first, a small geometric pattern on her right forearm, barely visible beneath the fluorescent kitchen lighting. Military insignia, he realized, though he couldn't identify the specific meaning. His brother had similar markings from his army service. Helen Wright spotted the tattoo moments later and frowned with bureaucratic disapproval. "Personal tattoos should be covered during work hours, Blake. School policy." "You told me to change shirts," Diana replied evenly. "Well, next time, wear appropriate undergarments to cover any inappropriate markings." The exchange might have ended there, another petty victory for institutional authority over individual dignity. But at that exact moment, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Mitchell walked through the cafeteria doors, and Diana Blake's carefully constructed invisibility was about to shatter completely. The Navy SEAL had come to Oakwood Elementary for a routine school visit, part of a community outreach program that connected military personnel with local educational institutions. At 36, Mitchell carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen combat and survived. His trained eyes automatically scanned for details that others missed. He noticed Diana immediately, not because she stood out, but because she blended in too well. Military personnel learned to recognize each other, even in civilian clothes. even in unexpected places. Something about her posture, her economy of movement, the way she positioned herself with clear sightlines to all exits, triggered his professional instincts. Then he saw her forearm. The tattoo was small, precise, and unmistakable to someone with Mitchell's background. A geometric crosshair pattern surrounding a stylized eagle's eye, rendered in black ink with military precision. He'd seen that exact symbol before in classified briefings, worn by personnel whose service record was marked with security classifications that most officers never encountered. Diana sensed his attention and looked up, her eyes meeting his across the cafeteria. The recognition was mutual and immediate, two veterans acknowledging each other in a space where neither belonged to the civilian world around them. Mitchell's mind raced through possibilities. The symbol on her arm marked elite sniper qualification from specific classified operations, the kind of service that generated legends in military circles and left no official traces in public records. If he was right about what he was seeing, this cafeteria worker was one of the most lethal precision shooters the military had ever produced. Diana broke eye contact first, turning back to her cleaning duties with renewed focus. But damage was done. Someone had finally recognized what she'd spent 3 years hiding. The next few minutes would determine whether her carefully constructed anonymity survived or whether the past she'd buried would finally surface to claim her.
Commander Mitchell forced himself to look away from Diana's tattoo, his military training kicking in to assess the situation before taking action. He'd learned long ago that assumptions could be deadly, even when they seemed obvious. The woman behind the serving line might carry the markings of an elite sniper, but context mattered. Military tattoos could be stolen, copied, or earned through channels that didn't match their apparent significance. Still, everything about her screamed authentic military bearing. The way she positioned herself with clear sightlines to exits, the economic precision of her movements, the controlled breathing that suggested someone accustomed to high-stress situations. If she was fake, she was the most convincing fake he'd ever encountered. Diana felt his continued observation like a physical weight. 3 years of careful invisibility were crumbling under the scrutiny of someone who knew what to look for. She'd chosen this job specifically because it rendered her invisible to the kind of people who might recognize her background. Cafeteria workers didn't interact with military personnel, didn't attend school board meetings, didn't appear in local newspapers or social media posts. Except today, apparently they did. Helen Wright noticed the exchange between Diana and the uniformed visitor with growing irritation. Her cafeteria operated on strict hierarchies, and unauthorized conversations with distinguished guests violated multiple unspoken rules about appropriate workplace behavior. "Blake," Helen called sharply, "finish cleaning Station 3 and prepare tomorrow's inventory sheets. We have work to complete." The dismissal was intended to reassert control while separating Diana from the Navy officer whose attention she didn't deserve. Helen had spent years cultivating relationships with school administrators and community leaders, positioning herself as the responsible face of food services. Having one of her subordinates engage independently with important visitors threatened that carefully constructed dynamic. Commander Mitchell understood the subtext immediately. He'd witnessed similar hierarchical power plays in military settings, though rarely with such obvious pettiness. The supervisor was marking territory, establishing that the cafeteria worker wasn't authorized to speak with people above her station. "Ma'am," he said to Helen, his voice carrying polite military formality, "I was actually hoping to speak with your entire staff about the school's nutrition program. Community outreach includes recognizing all the people who serve our children." Helen straightened, pleased by the attention but wary of its implications. "Of course, Commander. I'd be happy to discuss our efficiency metrics and cost management strategies. We've implemented several innovative programs under my supervision." She began launching into a detailed presentation about portion control and vendor negotiations, clearly expecting Diana to return to her cleaning duties while the adults discussed important matters. But Mitchell's attention kept drifting back to the woman's systematically sanitizing surfaces with military precision. Frank Delacroix observed the interaction from across the cafeteria, his maintenance work providing perfect cover for eavesdropping.
Something significant was happening, though he couldn't identify exactly what. The Navy officer seemed far more interested in Diana than in Helen's bureaucratic monologue, despite Diana's obvious attempts to avoid attention. Principal Hayes reappeared, drawn by the presence of a uniformed military officer in his cafeteria. Community relations with local military installations were important for school funding and public relations, making this visit a priority for his personal attention. "Commander Mitchell," Hayes said, extending his hand with practiced political enthusiasm. "Robert Hayes, principal, welcome to Oakwood Elementary. I trust Mrs. Wright is providing you with comprehensive information about our exceptional food services program." Mitchell shook the offered hand while continuing to observe Diana's methodical work routine. "Your facility appears very well managed, sir. I'm particularly impressed by the attention to detail I'm seeing from your staff." His comment was deliberately ambiguous, though Diana understood the subtext perfectly. Military personnel communicated in layers, especially when discussing classified or sensitive topics in civilian settings. He was acknowledging her without revealing specific knowledge, testing her response to see if she understood the protocol. Diana kept working, but her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. Frank noticed the change in her posture, recognizing stress indicators he'd learned to read in his brother after his combat tours. Whatever was happening between Diana and the Navy officer was significant enough to trigger her fight-or-flight response. Jessica Park entered the cafeteria to retrieve supplies for her afternoon art class, immediately noticing the cluster of adults engaged in serious conversation. As the newest teacher, she felt obliged to introduce herself to any military visitors, hoping to demonstrate her commitment to community engagement. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the group hesitantly. "I'm Jessica Park, first-grade teacher. Thank you for visiting our school, Commander."
Mitchell nodded politely, but his attention remained fixed on Diana's position near the industrial dishwasher. Something about her placement bothered him. She positioned herself with perfect tactical awareness, maintaining visual contact with all entrances while keeping her back to a solid wall. Civilian workers didn't think in those terms. "Miss Park," he said, "how long have you worked with this particular cafeteria staff?" The question surprised everyone. Helen frowned at the implication that cafeteria personnel were worth discussing individually. Principal Hayes looked confused about why a military officer would care about support staff employment history. Jessica seemed uncertain about the appropriate response. "Well, I'm new this year," Jessica replied carefully, "but Diana has been here since before I arrived. She's been very kind to students who struggle with lunch money issues." The comment drew sharp looks from both Helen and Principal Hayes. Unauthorized financial assistance to students violated multiple policies, creating liability issues that administrators preferred to handle through official channels. Helen made a mental note to address this policy violation privately. "That's very generous," Mitchell said. His tone suggested genuine respect rather than bureaucratic disapproval. "Military personnel understand the importance of taking care of people under your protection." His word choice was deliberate. Protection carried specific meaning in military contexts, implying responsibility that extended beyond job descriptions. Diana's cleaning movements faltered for just a moment, confirming that she understood the reference. Kevin Walsh approached the group, his natural curiosity about school politics overriding his usual cynicism about administrative interactions. At 48, he'd witnessed enough personnel changes to recognize when something unusual was happening. "Commander," Kevin said, "I teach 5th grade here. Are you conducting some kind of background evaluation? We appreciate knowing when our staff members have military connections." The question hung in the air with uncomfortable implications. Kevin's tone suggested he'd noticed Diana's tattoo and was fishing for information about potential security concerns. Military personnel working in schools sometimes trigger community anxiety, especially when their backgrounds weren't clearly documented. Commander Mitchell realized the conversation was approaching dangerous territory. If these civilians started asking specific questions about Diana's military service, he might be forced to either lie or reveal classified information. Neither option served anyone's interests. "I'm here for routine community outreach," he said firmly. "Standard protocol for maintaining positive relationships between military installations and local schools. Nothing more complicated than that."
His response was technically truthful while deflecting the implied security concerns, but damage was already done. Multiple school staff members had now noticed Diana's tattoo and were beginning to ask questions about her background. Diana finished her cleaning duties and began organizing supplies for the next day's meal preparation. Her movements remained controlled and professional, but Frank noticed increased tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing toward the exit doors. Flight response was building, he realized, recognizing the signs from his brother's worst episodes. Helen Wright seized the opportunity to reassert her authority while addressing the growing speculation about Diana's background. "Blake has been a reliable employee for 3 years," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Standard background checks were completed during hiring. She's cleared for food service work." The statement was intended to end speculation while subtly reinforcing Diana's subordinate status. Helen was making it clear that whatever military connection Diana might have was irrelevant to her current position as a minimum wage cafeteria worker. Commander Mitchell understood the dismissal, but also recognized an opportunity. If Diana had been working here for 3 years with standard background checks, either her military service was completely buried in classified files, or these people had never bothered to look beyond basic employment verification. "Mrs. Wright," he said carefully, "I'd like to observe your entire operation tomorrow during lunch service. Community outreach requires understanding how all personnel contribute to student nutrition and safety." The request was phrased as official business, making it difficult for Helen to refuse, while ensuring Mitchell would have another opportunity to interact with Diana under legitimate circumstances. Principal Hayes nodded approvingly. "Excellent idea, Commander. Full transparency in our operations. Mrs. Wright will provide complete access to all aspects of food services." Diana realized she was trapped. Tomorrow's lunch service would bring renewed scrutiny from someone who'd already recognized her tattoo and understood its significance. 3 years of anonymity were ending, whether she wanted them to or not. As the group dispersed and normal cafeteria operations resumed, Diana found herself alone with the knowledge that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the past she'd worked so hard to escape.
The following morning arrived with Phoenix's characteristic dry heat, but Diana Blake felt cold as she prepared for what might be her last day of anonymity. She'd spent the night researching Commander Mitchell online, confirming what she'd already suspected. He was exactly the kind of military professional who would recognize classified service markers and understand their implications. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Mitchell, 36 years old, Navy SEAL with 3 combat deployments and a service record that included several classified operations. His official biography mentioned community outreach and veteran support programs, but Diana could read between the lines. Military personnel with his background didn't make casual school visits for simple public relations. She arrived at Oakwood Elementary 30 minutes early, hoping to complete her opening preparations before the cafeteria filled with observers. The industrial kitchen felt different this morning, less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where her performance would determine her future. Frank Delacroix was already at work, mopping floors with his usual methodical precision. He looked up as Diana entered, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she moved with heightened awareness. "You okay this morning?" he asked quietly. "You seem wound up about something." Diana began checking inventory supplies, her hands automatically performing familiar tasks while her mind raced through contingency plans. "Just want everything perfect for the commander's visit." Frank nodded, but he wasn't convinced. 20 years of maintenance work had taught him to read people's stress levels, and Diana was radiating anxiety like heat from a furnace. Something about yesterday's encounter with the Navy officer had shaken her more than she was admitting. Mrs. Helen Wright arrived 15 minutes later, her clipboard clutched with bureaucratic authority and her expression suggesting someone prepared for battle. The presence of a high-ranking military officer in her cafeteria represented both opportunity and threat. Opportunity to showcase her management skills, threat that her carefully maintained control might be questioned. "Blake," Helen announced, "I want everything spotless today.
Commander Mitchell will be observing our entire operation, and I expect flawless performance from all staff members." Diana nodded silently, but Helen wasn't finished. The previous day's interaction between Diana and the Navy officer had bothered her all night, representing a breach of workplace hierarchy that needed to be corrected. "Furthermore," Helen continued, "you are not to engage in personal conversation with the commander. All communication should be directed through me as the appropriate supervisor. Your job is to serve food and maintain sanitation standards, nothing more." The directive was delivered with the petty authority of someone whose power depended on keeping subordinates firmly in their place. Diana understood the subtext. Helen was worried that Diana might somehow upstage her during the visit, threatening her position as the official face of food services. "Understood," Diana replied, her voice carrying no emotion, despite the humiliation of being treated like a child in front of Frank. Students began arriving for breakfast service an hour later, their cheerful chaos providing temporary distraction from the morning's tension. Diana fell into her familiar rhythm of food preparation and service, finding comfort in routine tasks that required no explanation or justification. Ashley Cooper, the second grader Diana had helped with lunch money issues, approached the serving line with a shy smile. "Good morning, Miss Diana. My mom sent money today, but she wanted me to say thank you for helping yesterday." Diana's expression softened as she placed fresh fruit on Ashley's tray. "Tell your mom she's raising a good kid. That's worth more than lunch money." Frank observed the interaction from across the kitchen, noting how Diana's entire demeanor changed when dealing with children. The military tension disappeared, replaced by genuine warmth and protective instinct. This woman cared about these kids in ways that went beyond job requirements. Mrs. Helen Wright noticed the interaction as well, but her interpretation was entirely different. Personal connections with students created liability issues and blurred professional boundaries that she worked hard to maintain. Diana's unauthorized kindness was becoming a pattern that needed correction. Commander Mitchell arrived at 10:30 a.m., 45 minutes before lunch service began. He wore dress uniform today, his ribbons and insignia marking him as someone with serious combat experience and command authority. Diana noticed immediately. His decoration included several that were only awarded for classified operations. Principal Hayes greeted Mitchell with enthusiastic professionalism, clearly hoping to leverage this visit for positive community relations. "Commander, welcome back to Oakwood Elementary. Mrs. Wright has prepared a comprehensive demonstration of our food services program." Helen stepped forward with her prepared presentation, eager to showcase her administrative competence. "Commander Mitchell, I've organized today's observation to highlight our efficiency metrics, cost management strategies, and health compliance protocols."
Mitchell nodded politely, but his attention was already focused on Diana's position behind the serving line. Yesterday's glimpse of her tattoo had kept him awake half the night, researching classified personnel records and trying to match her appearance with fragmented mission reports he'd seen in secure briefings. "Mrs. Wright," he said carefully, "I'm particularly interested in observing your staff's operational procedures under normal working conditions. Please continue regular activities without modification for my presence." The request was professionally phrased, but Diana understood its real meaning. He wanted to watch her work, looking for additional confirmation of what he suspected about her background. Military personnel moved differently than civilians, especially those with specialized training. Helen launched into her detailed presentation about inventory management and portion control, gesturing enthusiastically toward charts and efficiency metrics she'd prepared for the occasion. But Mitchell's eyes kept drifting back to Diana, who was methodically preparing serving stations with precision that suggested training far beyond food service requirements. Frank noticed the commander's continued focus on Diana and began piecing together fragments of yesterday's interaction. Military recognition, Diana's obvious tension, the tattoo he'd glimpsed on her forearm. something significant was happening that went beyond routine school visits. Jessica Park entered the cafeteria to retrieve lunch count information for her class, immediately sensing the heightened tension in the room. The presence of a uniformed Navy officer created an atmosphere of formal observation that made everyone move more carefully. "Good morning, Commander," Jessica said politely. "I hope your visit is informative." Mitchell smiled, but his attention remained fixed on Diana's work area. "Very informative, thank you. Your cafeteria staff appears exceptionally well trained." The comment was directed toward Helen, but Mitchell's eyes were on Diana as he spoke. Jessica followed his gaze, noting how Diana seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact while maintaining perfect operational efficiency. Students began arriving for lunch service, their familiar chaos filling the cafeteria with energy and noise. Diana moved into serving position, her hands steady as she began ladling food onto plastic trays. But Mitchell noticed details that others missed: the way she positioned herself with clear sightlines to all entrances, how she maintained perfect spatial awareness of everyone's location, the controlled breathing that suggested someone managing stress through practiced techniques. "Interesting technique," Mitchell commented to Helen, though his observation was clearly directed at Diana. "Your staff member shows remarkable efficiency under pressure." Helen preened at what she interpreted as praise for her training methods. "I maintain very high standards for all personnel, Commander. Consistency and discipline are essential in food service operations." But Mitchell wasn't watching Helen's management style. He was studying Diana's movements, looking for additional confirmation of what he'd suspected since yesterday. Military training left permanent marks on how people moved, reacted, and positioned themselves. Diana Blake moved like someone with advanced tactical training. The critical moment came when a lunch tray slipped from a student's hands, crashing to the floor with a loud metallic clang that echoed through the cafeteria. Most people jumped or turned toward the noise. Diana's response was different. Her body dropped into a defensive crouch for just a fraction of a second, her eyes sweeping the room for threats, and her hand moving instinctively toward her hip where a weapon would normally be carried. The reaction lasted less than 2 seconds before Diana caught herself and resumed normal posture, helping the student clean up the drop tray with gentle reassurance. But Mitchell had seen enough. That wasn't civilian startle response. That was combat veteran reaction to unexpected loud noises. Frank had witnessed the same thing happen with his brother dozens of times. Sudden noises triggered military defensive responses that couldn't be completely suppressed even years after leaving active duty. Diana Blake was definitely a veteran, and probably one with significant combat experience. Mitchell realized he needed to act carefully. If Diana was who he suspected, approaching her directly in front of civilian observers could create problems for both of them. Classified service records weren't supposed to be discussed in public settings, especially when the person involved was clearly trying to maintain privacy. But he couldn't also ignore what he'd observed: the tattoo, the movement patterns, the defensive responses. Everything pointed to Diana being a highly trained military specialist whose service record was probably classified at levels that required special clearance to access. As lunch service continued around them, Mitchell began planning his approach. He needed to speak with Diana privately, away from curious supervisors and civilian administrators who wouldn't understand the sensitivity of what they were discussing. The afternoon would bring that opportunity, and with it, the moment when Diana Blake's carefully constructed anonymity would finally crumble under the weight of recognition by someone who truly understood what her hidden markings meant. Lunch service ended with its usual controlled chaos of students rushing toward recess and custodial staff beginning afternoon cleanup routines. Commander Mitchell lingered near the serving line, ostensibly reviewing Helen Wright's efficiency charts, while actually studying Diana's methodical approach to equipment sanitization. Diana felt his continued observation like a physical weight pressing against her shoulders.
3 years of invisibility were dissolving under the scrutiny of someone trained to notice details that others missed. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Military personnel with classified backgrounds couldn't hide forever in civilian settings. The only question was whether Mitchell would handle the recognition professionally or create complications that would force her to disappear again. Helen Wright basked in what she perceived as prolonged attention to her operational excellence. Commander, as you can see, our post-service protocols exceed health department requirements by significant margins. I've implemented systems that ensure both efficiency and compliance. Mitchell nodded appropriately while tracking Diana's movements. She was performing routine cleaning tasks, but her spatial awareness remained constant, monitoring exits, tracking personnel locations, maintaining perfect situational consciousness. Civilian workers didn't think in those terms. Mrs. Wright, Mitchell said carefully, would it be possible to speak with individual staff members about their specific responsibilities? Understanding different perspectives helps with comprehensive assessment. Helen's smile faltered slightly. She preferred controlling all communication with important visitors, maintaining her position as the authoritative voice of food services operations. But refusing a direct request from a Navy commander would appear unprofessional. Of course, she replied, with forced enthusiasm. Though I should mention that Blake is primarily focused on manual tasks. She may not have detailed insights into our administrative procedures. The dismissal was intended to minimize Diana's importance while positioning Helen as the source of valuable information. Mitchell understood the dynamic. Workplace hierarchies often prevented meaningful communication between different organizational levels. I appreciate all perspectives, Mitchell said diplomatically. Sometimes frontline workers notice operational details that management might miss. Frank Delacroix observed the exchange while organizing cleaning supplies, recognizing tension that went beyond normal workplace interactions. Something significant was building between the Navy officer and Diana, though the specific nature remained unclear. Principal Hayes reappeared with his characteristic administrative urgency, clearly hoping to maximize positive publicity from the military visit. Commander Mitchell, I trust your observation has been illuminating. We pride ourselves on operational excellence at all levels. Very impressive, Mitchell replied. His diplomatic training provided appropriate responses, while his tactical mind focused on the approaching conversation with Diana. I'd like to conclude with brief individual discussions with key personnel. Hayes nodded enthusiastically. Excellent approach. Comprehensive assessment requires multiple perspectives. Helen Wright's expression tightened further. Individual discussions meant losing control over information flow, potentially allowing subordinates to contradict her carefully crafted narrative about cafeteria efficiency. Blake, Helen called sharply, the commander would like to discuss your cleaning procedures. Please be prepared to answer questions about sanitation protocols. Diana stopped her equipment cleaning and approached the group, her posture automatically shifting into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. Mitchell noticed the change immediately. Shoulders square, controlled breathing, direct eye contact that suggested someone accustomed to reporting to superior officers. Ma'am, Diana said to Helen, though her eyes briefly met Mitchell's with unmistakable recognition. Mitchell realized he needed to separate Diana from the civilian observers before attempting any meaningful conversation. Classified service discussions couldn't happen in front of school administrators who lacked appropriate security clearances. Actually, he said to the group, individual discussions work best in private settings. Workplace dynamics sometimes inhibit honest communication. Helen opened her mouth to object, but Principal Hayes intervened with bureaucratic enthusiasm. Absolutely, Commander. Professional assessment requires confidential interviews. Mrs. Wright, perhaps you could show me those budget projections we discussed earlier. The suggestion was delivered with administrative authority that Helen couldn't refuse without appearing uncooperative. She reluctantly followed Hayes toward the office area, leaving Mitchell alone and Diana in the now empty cafeteria. Frank lingered nearby, ostensibly organizing maintenance equipment, while actually positioning himself within hearing range. Military recognition dynamics fascinated him, especially given Diana's obvious stress levels. Mitchell waited until the civilians were out of earshot before addressing Diana directly. His tone shifted from diplomatic politeness to professional military communication. "Sergeant Blake," he said quietly, using the rank he suspected she'd held. "We need to talk."
Diana's reaction confirmed his suspicions immediately. Her posture straightened further, her hands moved to parade rest position, and her eyes focused with the direct attention of someone responding to proper military address. "Sir," she replied, the single word carrying acknowledgement, weariness, and resigned acceptance. Mitchell studied her face, noting stress markers that suggested someone carrying significant psychological weight. 3 years of civilian employment hadn't erased military conditioning, but they'd clearly taken a toll on someone accustomed to professional respect and meaningful work. "That tattoo on your forearm," Mitchell continued, keeping his voice low enough that Frank couldn't overhear specific details. "Geometric crosshair pattern with eagle's eye center. That's not standard military ink." Diana remained silent, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The tattoo represented service she couldn't discuss, missions that remained classified at levels requiring special access authorizations. "I've seen that marking twice before," Mitchell said, his tone carrying growing certainty. "Once in a classified briefing about precision engagement operations in Iraq, once on a memorial wall at Quantico that honors snipers whose service can't be publicly acknowledged." The statement hung between them like a bridge, spanning the gap between her hidden past and uncertain present. Diana understood that denial was no longer possible. Mitchell knew exactly what her tattoo represented and wouldn't be easily deflected. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." Mitchell appreciated her caution. Military personnel with classified backgrounds were trained never to confirm sensitive information without proper authorization, even when speaking with other military professionals. "I'm suggesting," Mitchell replied, "that you're considerably overqualified for cafeteria work, and that your current situation represents a significant waste of specialized capabilities." Frank Delacroix moved closer, drawn by the intensity of their conversation despite his inability to hear specific words. Whatever was happening between these two felt important in ways that went beyond routine school visits. Diana glanced toward the office area where Helen and Principal Hayes were engaged in animated discussion about budget allocations. Their civilian concerns felt increasingly distant from the military reality that was reasserting itself through Mitchell's recognition. "Sir," she said quietly, "some service records are classified for good reasons. Some capabilities are better left in the past." Mitchell understood immediately. Military personnel with classified service markers often struggled with reintegration into civilian life, especially when their specialized skills had limited peaceful applications. "Maybe," Mitchell replied, "but hiding those capabilities in minimum wage employment serves nobody's interests. Not yours, not the military's, not the civilians who could benefit from your experience." Diana felt the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity crumbling. 3 years of finding purpose in feeding children, protecting students who couldn't protect themselves, serving in the shadows while others received recognition for more visible contributions. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. Mitchell recognized the question as admission, acknowledgement that his suspicions were accurate and that further pretense was pointless. Diana Blake was exactly who he'd suspected, and she was ready to discuss the implications. "I want to understand how someone with your background ended up serving lunch to elementary school children, and whether that situation represents choice or necessity. The distinction was crucial. Military personnel sometimes chose civilian employment for personal reasons, family obligations, geographic preferences, a desire for different types of service. But they sometimes ended up in inappropriate positions due to bureaucratic failures, inadequate support systems, or institutional neglect. Diana looked around the empty cafeteria, seeing it differently now that her military identity was being acknowledged. 3 years of finding purpose in feeding children, protecting students who couldn't protect themselves, serving in the shadows while others received recognition for more visible contributions. It represents survival, she said finally. Some transitions are harder than others. Mitchell understood immediately. Military personnel with highly classified backgrounds often faced unique challenges during civilian reintegration. Their service couldn't be publicly acknowledged, their skills had limited peaceful applications, and their psychological adjustments occurred without support systems designed for conventional veterans. Diana, he said, using her first name to signal the conversation was moving beyond formal military protocol, you don't have to survive alone. There are resources, programs, people who understand what you've carried. Frank Delacroix watched Diana's posture shift as emotional barriers began cracking under the weight of recognition and understanding. 3 years of isolation were ending, whether she was ready or not. The question now was whether that ending would lead to healing or create new complications that would force her to disappear once again.
Diana stared at Commander Mitchell for a long moment, weighing risks that had kept her awake for 3 years. Trust was a luxury she'd abandoned when the military buried her service record to protect classified operations. But something in Mitchell's eyes suggested understanding that went beyond professional curiosity. Ramadi, Iraq, 2018. She said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Operation Silent Guardian, 7-month deployment with the 3rd Special Forces Group. Mitchell's expression shifted from suspicion to recognition to something approaching reverence. He'd heard whispers about Silent Guardian in classified briefings, an operation so sensitive that most details remained redacted even in secure military channels. Diana's eyes grew distant as memories she'd spent years suppressing began surfacing. I was Staff Sergeant Diana Blake then, designated marksman with the 75th Ranger Regiment before selection for Joint Special Operations. My specialty was precision engagement in urban environments. Frank Delacroix maintained his position near the maintenance equipment, recognizing that whatever was happening between these two had moved beyond casual conversation into territory that felt both sacred and dangerous. The tattoo, Mitchell prompted gently, understanding that Diana needed to tell this story at her own pace. Diana's hand moved unconsciously to her forearm, tracing the geometric pattern beneath her sleeve. Eagle's Eye designation, awarded to snipers who complete missions requiring exceptional precision under extreme circumstances. The euphemism carried weight that civilian ears couldn't comprehend. Military personnel understood that exceptional precision meant eliminating targets that conventional weapons couldn't reach under conditions that most soldiers couldn't survive. Ramadi was supposed to be a stabilization operation, Diana continued, her voice taking on the flat, controlled tone of someone recounting trauma. Intelligence suggested insurgent leadership was coordinating attacks from within civilian population centers. Our mission was surgical elimination of high-value targets while minimizing collateral damage. Mitchell nodded, familiar with the impossible mathematics of urban warfare, where success was measured in lives saved rather than enemies killed. Precision marksmen carried the heaviest burden, making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. I was positioned on Overwatch for 6 months. Rooftops, abandoned buildings, concealed positions that provided clear sightlines to target areas. My job was protecting convoys, supporting ground operations, and eliminating threats that other units couldn't engage safely. The clinical description masked psychological weight that few people could comprehend. Military snipers operated in isolation, carrying responsibility for decisions that haunted them long after returning home. The tattoo commemoration came after the school incident, August 15th, 2018. Intelligence reported insurgent leadership meeting in a compound adjacent to an elementary school. 300 children in the building next door. Mitchell understood immediately why this operation had earned classified status. Urban precision engagements near civilian targets created political complications that extended far beyond military objectives. Ground assault wasn't viable. Too much risk of crossfire reaching the school. Air support would have guaranteed civilian casualties. Command authorized precision engagement with specific parameters. Eliminate 3 targets simultaneously to prevent coordinated response. The tactical challenge was nearly impossible. 3 targets, multiple positions, requiring perfectly synchronized elimination to prevent survivors from triggering explosive devices that would have destroyed the adjacent school. I had 17 minutes to establish position, confirm target identification, and execute coordinated engagement. Wind conditions were marginal, visibility was compromised by smoke from burning vehicles, and I was operating at maximum effective range for the weapon system. Frank found himself holding his breath, recognizing that Diana was describing events that had required capabilities far beyond normal military training. Whatever had happened in Iraq, it had demanded skills that very few people possessed. 3 shots, fired within a 4-second window. Range, 847 meters. Weather conditions, 15-knot crosswind with variable gusts. Targets were positioned in separate buildings with limited exposure windows. Mitchell understood the tactical complexity immediately. Engaging multiple targets at that range, under those conditions, required mathematical precision and psychological control that marked elite-level capability. All 3 targets eliminated without collateral damage. Diana said simply, "The school evacuation proceeded without incident. 300 children went home to their families that night because the coordinated attack was prevented." The stark summary concealed emotional weight that Diana had carried alone for 6 years. Military snipers process success differently than other combat personnel. Their victories were measured in lives protected rather than enemies defeated.
The Eagle's Eye designation was awarded 2 weeks later, Diana explained. The tattoo was applied by the unit medic using ink mixed with materials from the mission site, tradition for precision marksmen whose actions prevent mass casualty events. Mitchell recognized the significance immediately. Military tattoos carried different meaning than civilian body art. They marked specific achievements, commemorated fallen comrades, or honored service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. But something went wrong after the mission, Mitchell observed, noting the pain and Diana's expression. Diana's composure cracked slightly. Investigation by the Inspector General's office. Someone questioned the engagement parameters, suggested that civilian casualties might have been avoided through different tactical approaches. Political pressure from Iraqi government officials who wanted American military presence reduced. The bureaucratic nightmare was familiar to Mitchell from his own experience with classified operations. Military personnel who succeeded in impossible situations sometimes found their achievements questioned by officials who'd never faced similar challenges. The investigation lasted 4 months. Every aspect of the mission was scrutinized, analyzed, second-guessed by people who'd never held a rifle in combat. My service record was classified to protect operational details, but the classification also prevented me from defending my actions publicly. I understood the impossible position immediately. Classified service records protected national security interests, but often left military personnel unable to prove their competence or defend their reputation. Final determination was mission accomplished within acceptable parameters. Diana continued bitterly, but the political pressure required scapegoating. I was quietly reassigned to non-combat duties and encouraged to pursue civilian employment at the end of my enlistment. The euphemism, encouraged to pursue civilian employment, carried specific meaning in military contexts, forced retirement disguised as voluntary separation. My discharge papers list administrative separation with standard veteran benefits, no mention of classified operations, no documentation of specialized training, no evidence that I'd ever done anything beyond routine military service. Frank Delacroix realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a military hero whose achievements had been buried by the same system she'd served. Diana's current position as a cafeteria worker represented institutional failure that went beyond individual tragedy. So I became invisible, Diana concluded. 3 years of minimum wage employment, living paycheck to paycheck, serving children who needed protection in the only way the system would allow. Mitchell studied Diana's face, seeing exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. Military personnel who carried classified service records often struggled with civilian reintegration, especially when their achievements couldn't be acknowledged or their skills couldn't be properly utilized. Diana, he said quietly, what you did in Ramadi saved 300 children's lives. That matters more than bureaucratic complications or political pressure. Diana's eyes filled with tears she'd held back for 3 years. Those children in Iraq got to go home to their families. These children here get nutritious meals and someone who watches for signs of trouble. It's all service, just different forms. Mitchell understood the connection immediately. Diana had found purpose in protecting children, whether through precision marksmanship in Iraq or daily meals in Phoenix. The scale was different, but the motivation remained constant. But you're capable of so much more, Mitchell said gently. The military needs experienced personnel who understand complex operations. Veterans organizations need advocates who've navigated bureaucratic failures. Law enforcement agencies need instructors who can teach precision skills. Diana wiped her eyes, composing herself with practiced discipline. Those opportunities require background verification that would expose classified service records. My capabilities can't be documented without revealing information that remains protected. The catch-22 was perfect and cruel. Her qualifications for meaningful employment couldn't be proven without compromising national security interests that her former commanders still protected. Mitchell realized that Diana's situation represented systemic failure that affected hundreds of military personnel with classified backgrounds. Their service couldn't be acknowledged, their skills couldn't be properly utilized, and their transitions to civilian life occurred without adequate support systems. There might be another way, he said carefully. Programs that work with veterans whose service can't be publicly documented. Organizations that understand the value of classified capabilities without requiring public disclosure. Diana looked at him with cautious hope for the first time in 3 years. The hope of meaningful work that honored her skills without compromising security interests had seemed impossible until now. But hope was dangerous for someone who'd learned to find safety in anonymity.
Commander Mitchell spent the drive back to his office replaying every detail of his conversation with Diana Blake. 3 years of military intelligence training had taught him to verify information before taking action. But everything about Diana's story aligned with classified briefings he'd received about Operation Silent Guardian. The mission had been legend among special operations communities, a textbook example of precision engagement under impossible conditions. Military personnel with his security clearance knew the basic perimeters: multiple target elimination near civilian infrastructure, zero collateral damage, successful prevention of mass casualty event. But the specific details Diana had provided weren't available in standard after-action reports. Her knowledge of wind conditions, range calculations, and tactical challenges suggested either direct participation or access to classified mission debriefings. Since she clearly wasn't an intelligence analyst,
The logical conclusion was that Diana Blake had been the sniper responsible for one of the most successful precision engagements in recent military history. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Back at Naval Special Warfare Command, Mitchell accessed secure terminals that required biometric authentication and specialized clearance codes. His position as a community outreach coordinator provided legitimate cover for researching veteran support programs, but what he was really investigating went far beyond standard personal records. The classified database search for Diana Blake returned no results. Neither did searches for Staff Sergeant Blake, 75th Ranger Regiment 2018, or Operation Silent Guardian personnel. Either Diana had fabricated an elaborate story with remarkable attention to detail, or her service record had been so thoroughly classified that it existed only in compartmentalized files requiring special access authorization. Mitchell tried a different approach, searching for mission parameters that matched Diana's description. August 15, 2018, Ramadi, Iraq, precision engagement near civilian infrastructure. The search returned a single classified file with security markings that made his breath catch. Operation Silent Guardian mission debrief. Classification level: top secret/compartmentalized, access restricted to personnel with Special Operations Command authorization and Iraq Theater Intelligence clearance. Mitchell's clearance level granted access to the executive summary, but detailed operational information remained redacted. Still, what he could read confirmed Diana's basic timeline and location. 3 high-value targets eliminated simultaneously through precision engagement. Civilian casualties, 0. Mission assessment, complete success. The personnel roster was entirely blacked out, protecting the identities of operators whose service remained classified for national security reasons. But mission-critical personnel annotations included references to designated marksman, Eagle's Eye qualified, and precision engagement specialist, urban environment certified. Mitchell realized he needed higher-level verification to confirm Diana's involvement, but standard channels would require explaining why a Navy officer was investigating an Army operation from 6 years ago. Unauthorized access to classified personnel records constituted serious breach of security protocols. Instead, he reached out to Colonel Michael Torres, his former commanding officer who now worked in Pentagon Special Operations Coordination. Torres had the clearance and authority to access compartmentalized files without triggering security investigations. "Mike," Mitchell said during a secure phone call 30 minutes later, "I need information about Operation Silent Guardian, specifically personnel records for the designated marksman."
Torres was quiet for several seconds. "Ryan, that's not standard information sharing territory. Why are you asking about classified Army operations?" Mitchell chose his words carefully. "I've encountered someone who claims participation in that mission. I need to verify whether they're legitimate or fabricating military service for personal gain." It was technically true, though Mitchell's motivation was verifying Diana's story to help her rather than expose potential fraud. Military personnel took stolen valor accusations seriously, especially when they involved classified operations that couldn't be publicly verified. "Give me 24 hours, Torres said finally. "I'll need to make some calls and access files that require special authorization. This stays between us until I have complete information." Mitchell agreed, understanding that premature action could create complications for everyone involved. If Diana was lying about her service, she needed to be confronted appropriately. If she was telling the truth, she deserved support that acknowledged her actual contributions rather than her current circumstances. Meanwhile, back at Oakwood Elementary, Diana continued her afternoon cleaning routine while processing the emotional impact of finally sharing her story with someone who understood its significance. 3 years of carrying that weight alone had taken a psychological toll that she'd barely acknowledged even to herself. Frank Delacroix approached her workstation with unusual directness, abandoning his normal pattern of casual conversation for something more serious. "Diana," he said quietly, "I don't know what you and that Navy officer discussed, but you look like someone who just had surgery without anesthesia.
Whatever's happening, you don't have to handle it alone. Diana paused in her equipment sanitization, surprised by Frank's perceptiveness. She'd assumed her emotional state wasn't visible to civilian observers, but military training apparently couldn't hide everything from someone who'd learned to read stress in his veteran brother. It's complicated, Frank. Some conversations change everything, even when you don't want them to. Frank nodded, recognizing the tone of someone facing unwanted life transitions. My brother went through something similar when he came back from Afghanistan. Took him 3 years to admit that hiding from his service record wasn't helping anyone, especially himself. The parallel was uncomfortably accurate. Diana had spent 3 years convincing herself that anonymity was safer than acknowledgement, that invisible service was more sustainable than professional recognition. But Mitchell's questions had forced her to confront whether that choice represented healing or avoidance. "What happened to your brother?" Diana asked. He eventually connected with veteran support programs that understood classified service complications, found work with a private security company that valued his specialized training without requiring public disclosure of his operational background. Diana felt a flicker of hope mixed with familiar weariness. Private sector opportunities often promised more than they delivered, especially for veterans whose qualifications couldn't be conventionally verified.
The key, Frank continued, was finding people who understood the difference between classified service and fabricated credentials. Military personnel can spot authentic experience even when official records aren't available. His observation aligned with Diana's assessment of Commander Mitchell. Genuine military professionals could recognize legitimate service through behavioral cues that civilian observers missed entirely. Helen Wright reappeared from her budget meeting with Principal Hayes, her expression suggesting successful navigation of administrative politics. She surveyed the cafeteria with proprietorial satisfaction, noting that cleaning protocols were proceeding according to her established schedules. "Blake," Helen called, "I trust your conversation with Commander Mitchell was productive. He seemed impressed with our operational efficiency." Diana understood the subtext immediately. Helen was fishing for information about their private discussion while subtly claiming credit for any positive assessment Mitchell might have provided. "He asked standard questions about sanitation procedures," Diana replied neutrally. "I provided appropriate responses." It was technically accurate, while avoiding details that Helen wouldn't understand and couldn't properly handle. Military recognition dynamics weren't appropriate topics for civilian workplace discussion. But Helen's expressions suggested she suspected more significant conversation had occurred. Military officers didn't typically conduct extended private interviews with cafeteria workers about routine cleaning protocols. "Well," Helen said with forced brightness, "I'm sure he appreciated your professionalism. This visit reflects positively on our entire program." Diana nodded appropriately while inwardly recognizing how disconnected Helen's concerns were from the actual significance of what had transpired. Bureaucratic success metrics seemed increasingly irrelevant when measured against questions about authentic purpose and meaningful service. Jessica Park entered the cafeteria to retrieve forgotten teaching materials, immediately noticing the tension that seemed to follow Diana like an invisible cloud. "Diana," Jessica said gently, "you seem distracted today. Is everything okay?" It was the first time in 3 years that a civilian colleague had expressed genuine concern about Diana's emotional state rather than just her work performance. The kindness was unexpected and somehow more threatening than Helen's bureaucratic indifference. "Just processing some unexpected information," Diana replied carefully. "Sometimes conversations reveal things you thought were safely buried." Jessica nodded with the incomplete understanding of someone who recognized emotional distress without comprehending its specific source. "If you need to talk, I'm a good listener. Sometimes outside perspectives help with complicated situations." Diana appreciated the offer while recognizing its limitations. Jessica's civilian experience provided no framework for understanding classified service complications or institutional betrayal by military bureaucracy. But the kindness mattered anyway. 3 years of invisible service had taught Diana to value authentic human connection, even when full understanding wasn't possible.
As afternoon shifted toward evening and Oakwood Elementary transitioned from active education to after-hours maintenance, Diana realized that her conversation with Mitchell had created momentum she couldn't control. Within 24 hours, her carefully constructed anonymity would either transform into something sustainable or collapse entirely. The question was whether she had the courage to find out which outcome awaited her.
Colonel Michael Torres called Commander Mitchell at 0800 hours the following morning, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent all night reviewing classified files that most military personnel would never see. "Ryan," Torres began without preamble, "you need to sit down for this conversation. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this call, and it changes everything you think you know about that person you're investigating." Mitchell was already seated at his secure workstation, but Torres's tone made him understand that emotional preparation was more important than physical positioning. "The operation you asked about is real," Torres continued. "August 15th, 2018, Ramadi, Iraq. Operation Silent Guardian. What you probably don't know is that mission prevented what intelligence analysts later determined would have been the largest civilian casualty event in that theater of operations." Mitchell felt his stomach tighten as classified details emerged that hadn't appeared in any briefings he'd accessed. 3 suicide bombers coordinating simultaneous detonation in a complex that housed an elementary school, a medical clinic, and a marketplace, Torres explained. Conservative estimates suggested 800 to 1,200 civilian casualties if the attack had succeeded. The numbers were staggering, transforming Diana's precision engagement from impressive military action to genuine life-saving heroism on a scale that few operations achieved. "Your person of interest," Torres continued, "was Staff Sergeant Diana Blake, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to 3rd Special Forces Group for Joint Operations. Her official military occupational specialty was 11B, Infantry, but her classified specialty was 18E, Communications Sergeant with additional qualification as Designated Marksman." Mitchell realized that Diana had actually understated her qualifications during their conversation. Multiple military occupational specialties indicated cross-training that only the most exceptional personnel received. The precision engagement she executed required mathematical calculations that most personnel couldn't perform under laboratory conditions, much less in active combat zones, Torres said. Range, 847 meters. Crosswind, 15 knots with variable gusts. 3 targets in separate buildings with exposure windows measured in seconds. The technical complexity was beyond what Mitchell had initially understood. Diana had essentially performed 3 simultaneous impossible shots under conditions that would challenge Olympic-level competitive marksmen. "But here's where it gets complicated," Torres continued, his voice darkening. "The investigation that followed wasn't about mission effectiveness. It was about political liability. Iraqi government officials wanted American military presence reduced, and successful special operations created pressure for continued involvement. Mitchell understood immediately. Military success sometimes became political embarrassment when objectives conflicted with diplomatic goals. The Inspector General's investigation was designed to find problems, not validate achievements. Diana's engagement was scrutinized not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Politicians needed reasons to reduce special operations activity, and successful missions contradicted that narrative. The bureaucratic betrayal was worse than Diana had described. Her heroism hadn't just been buried for security reasons, it had been actively investigated to serve political objectives that had nothing to do with military effectiveness.
Final determination was that her actions were within acceptable parameters, but raised questions about engagement protocols in civilian-dense environments. Translation: she saved hundreds of lives, but politicians needed scapegoats to justify policy changes. Mitchell felt anger building as he processed the institutional failure Diana had endured. Military personnel who succeeded in impossible missions deserved recognition, not political persecution disguised as procedural review. "Where is her service record now?" Mitchell asked.
Classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access, Torres replied. Her discharge paperwork lists administrative separation with standard benefits, no mention of classified operations, no documentation of specialized training, no evidence that she ever did anything beyond routine military service. The cover-up was complete and systematic. Diana Blake had been erased from military history to serve political objectives that had nothing to do with her actual performance or capabilities. "Mike," Mitchell said carefully, "this woman is currently working as a cafeteria worker at an elementary school, making minimum wage and being treated like invisible labor by people who have no idea what she's accomplished." Torres was quiet for several seconds. That's not uncommon for personnel with classified backgrounds, especially when their service records are buried for political reasons. The transition support systems aren't designed to handle cases where achievements can't be documented. Mitchell understood the systemic failure immediately. Diana's situation represented institutional betrayal that extended far beyond individual tragedy. It was evidence of a system that used military personnel for political objectives without providing appropriate support for their reintegration. "What can be done?" Mitchell asked. "Officially, nothing. Her service record remains classified and will probably stay that way for decades. Unofficially, there are programs that work with veterans whose capabilities can't be conventionally documented. Private sector opportunities that value authenticated military experience without requiring public disclosure." Torres provided contact information for several organizations that specialized in supporting military personnel with classified backgrounds. Private security companies, consulting firms, and veteran advocacy groups that understood the unique challenges faced by personnel whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Ryan, what this woman accomplished in Iraq represents the finest traditions of military service. She deserves better than minimum wage anonymity, even if the system that betrayed her can't officially acknowledge that fact." Meanwhile, at Oakwood Elementary, Diana arrived for work with the emotional exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night processing conversations that had changed everything she thought she'd accepted about her situation. Frank Delacroix noticed her distraction immediately as she began morning food preparation with mechanical precision that suggested someone operating on autopilot while their mind processed more significant concerns. "Diana," he said quietly, "you look like someone who just learned that everything they thought was settled is actually still pending." Diana paused in her inventory checking, recognizing the accuracy of Frank's observation. "Yesterday's conversation opened doors I thought were permanently closed. I'm not sure whether that's opportunity or complication." Frank understood the ambivalence. Military veterans often struggled with transitions that required abandoning familiar coping strategies for uncertain alternatives. "My brother went through something similar," Frank said. "The hardest part wasn't deciding what to do next. It was accepting that he deserved better than what he'd convinced himself was sufficient." The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Diana had spent 3 years convincing herself that invisible service was meaningful enough, that anonymous contribution was sufficient purpose, that asking for more was unrealistic given her circumstances.
But Commander Mitchell's recognition had forced her to confront whether those beliefs represented healing or resignation. Helen Wright arrived with her characteristic bureaucratic energy, immediately sensing something different in the cafeteria's atmosphere. Diana's distraction was subtle but noticeable to someone who monitored staff behavior for signs of productivity issues.
Blake, Helen said, I trust yesterday's discussion with Commander Mitchell hasn't created any distractions from your regular duties. Military visitors sometimes give personnel inflated impressions of their importance. The comment was intended to preemptively deflate any ego inflation that might result from attention by important visitors. Helen had learned that staff members who received individual recognition sometimes developed unrealistic expectations about their value to the organization. Diana understood the subtext perfectly, while recognizing how completely Helen misunderstood what had actually transpired. Military recognition dynamics weren't about ego inflation. They were about authentic acknowledgement of capabilities and service that deserved respect. No distractions, Diana replied evenly. Standard questions about operational procedures. But Frank noticed the way Diana's jaw tightened when Helen delivered her dismissive comment. 3 years of accepting institutional indifference were becoming harder to sustain now that someone had finally recognized her actual worth. Jessica Park entered the cafeteria earlier than usual, her first-year teacher anxiety driving her to over-prepare for each day's lessons. She immediately noticed the tension between Helen and Diana, recognizing workplace dynamics that felt unnecessarily harsh. "Good morning, Diana," Jessica said warmly. "I wanted to thank you again for helping Ashley Cooper with her lunch situation. Her mother called last night to express appreciation for your kindness." The gratitude was genuine and represented exactly the kind of positive feedback that Diana found meaningful. Protecting children, even in small ways, connected her current service to the mission orientation that had defined her military career. Helen frowned at the exchange, seeing personal interactions with families as potential liability rather than evidence of dedication. Cafeteria workers were supposed to maintain professional distance from students and parents. "Blake," Helen said sharply, "personal interactions with families should be directed through appropriate administrative channels. We have protocols for managing student assistance requests." Diana felt familiar anger building at Helen's bureaucratic indifference to a child's basic needs. Military training had taught her to prioritize mission accomplishment over procedural compliance, especially when protecting vulnerable people was involved. "The child needed food," Diana said simply. "Protocols are secondary to basic human welfare." The response carried military directness that Helen recognized as subtle insubordination. Diana was questioning administrative authority in ways that threatened workplace hierarchy. Frank observed the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that Diana's emotional state was shifting from resignation to something more active. Yesterday's conversation with the Navy officer had apparently triggered changes that were making her previous acceptance of institutional indifference more difficult to maintain. Principal Hayes appeared in the cafeteria doorway, his timing coinciding with the tension between Helen and Diana in ways that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation. "Mrs. Wright," Hayes said, "could I speak with you privately about yesterday's military visit? I'd like to discuss Commander Mitchell's assessment of our operations." Helen immediately followed Hayes toward his office, eager to claim credit for positive feedback while positioning herself as the primary point of contact for future military interactions. Alone with Frank, Diana felt control that she'd maintained for 3 years beginning to crack under pressure from recognition, possibility, and the growing difficulty of accepting treatment that her service record, if it could be revealed, proved she didn't deserve. "Frank," she said quietly, "what happens when invisible service becomes visible? When people finally see what you've been carrying alone?" Frank understood that Diana was asking about more than workplace dynamics. She was processing fundamental questions about identity, purpose,
and whether she had the courage to reclaim recognition that her achievements had earned. My brother would say that visibility is scary because it means you can't hide anymore. But hiding never healed anyone. It just postponed the hard work of figuring out what comes next. Diana realized that Commander Mitchell's investigation would soon provide answers that would force her to choose between continued anonymity and uncertain possibilities that acknowledged her actual capabilities. The choice felt both terrifying and inevitable.
Commander Mitchell arrived at Oakwood Elementary at 1100 hours, carrying a manila envelope containing information that would either liberate Diana Blake from 3 years of invisible servitude or complicate her life in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. His conversation with Colonel Torres had provided official verification of what he'd suspected, but verification alone wouldn't solve the complex challenges Diana faced. Diana spotted Mitchell through the cafeteria's service window as he entered the building, her trained eyes immediately noting the purposeful stride and formal bearing that indicated someone carrying significant information. 3 years of hypervigilance hadn't been erased by civilian employment. Military personnel learned to read body language that revealed operational status. Helen Wright intercepted Mitchell at the administrative desk with characteristic bureaucratic enthusiasm, clearly hoping to position herself as the primary point of contact for any important communications. "Commander Mitchell," Helen said with forced brightness, "how wonderful to see you return so soon. I trust yesterday's observation provided valuable insights into our operational excellence." Mitchell nodded politely while scanning the cafeteria for Diana's location. "Mrs. Wright, I need to speak with Staff Sergeant Blake about veteran support programs that might be relevant to her background." The casual use of Diana's military rank caused Helen's expression to shift from bureaucratic confidence to confused uncertainty. Cafeteria workers didn't typically warrant military courtesy titles, especially from high-ranking Navy officers. "I'm sorry," Helen said carefully, "but Black is civilian personnel. I'm not sure why military terminology would be appropriate." Mitchell realized he'd inadvertently revealed information that Diana hadn't shared with her civilian colleagues. Military recognition protocols had overridden his diplomatic training, potentially creating complications that Diana would have to navigate. "My apologies," Mitchell said diplomatically. "Veteran support services are available to all former military personnel, regardless of their current employment status. I'd like to discuss these opportunities with any staff members who might benefit." The technically accurate explanation avoided specific details about Diana's classified service record, but Helen's expression suggested she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about Diana's background might be incomplete. Principal Hayes appeared from his office, drawn by the sound of military conversation in his hallway. As an administrator, he'd learned to monitor any discussions that might affect school operations or personnel policies. "Commander Mitchell," Hayes said, extending his hand with practiced political courtesy. "Unexpected pleasure to see you again so soon. How can Oakwood Elementary assist with your veteran outreach programs?" Mitchell appreciated the opening Hayes had provided, allowing him to frame his visit in terms of official business rather than personal interest in specific personnel. "Principal Hayes, I'm here to discuss career transition opportunities for veterans whose military service might qualify them for positions that better utilize their specialized training and experience." The diplomatic language carried implications that both administrators understood without fully comprehending. Military personnel with specialized training often possessed capabilities that extended far beyond their current civilian employment. Diana emerged from the kitchen area, her posture automatically shifting into military bearing as she approached the group of administrators and the Navy officer whose investigation had apparently reached some conclusion. "Commander," she said with controlled formality, "Mrs. Wright mentioned you wanted to discuss veteran services." Mitchell studied Diana's expression, noting stress markers that suggested someone preparing for news that would change everything about her carefully constructed civilian life. "Sergeant Blake," he said quietly, "I have information that might interest you. Perhaps we could speak privately." Helen's frown deepened at the continued use of military rank for her subordinate cafeteria worker. Whatever was happening between Diana and the Navy officer was beyond her understanding and therefore beyond her control. "Blake," Helen said sharply, "you're scheduled for inventory management this afternoon. Personal discussions should be conducted during break periods."
The interruption was intended to reassert workplace hierarchy while reminding Diana that her primary obligations were to cafeteria operations, not military networking. Diana looked at Helen with an expression that Frank Delacroix, observing from across the room, recognized as someone reaching the limits of institutional tolerance. 3 years of accepting bureaucratic indifference were colliding with renewed military recognition in ways that made continued submission increasingly difficult. Mrs. Wright, Diana said with controlled precision, this discussion relates to veteran transition services that might affect my employment status. I believe Principal Hayes would consider that relevant to school personnel policies. The response carried military directness that Helen wasn't accustomed to hearing from subordinate staff members. Diana was asserting authority rather than accepting dismissal, signaling changes in her self-perception that extended beyond simple workplace dynamics. Principal Hayes recognized potential personnel complications and intervened with administrative pragmatism. Mrs. Wright, veteran support services are legitimate personnel matters. Please allow Commander Mitchell to conduct his assessment. Helen reluctantly stepped aside, though her expression suggested she would be monitoring this conversation for any developments that threatened her supervisory authority. Mitchell gestured toward an empty classroom adjacent to the cafeteria, providing privacy for a discussion that would determine Diana's immediate future. As they walked, Diana felt familiar military anticipation, the psychological preparation that preceded mission briefings or assignment changes. Inside the empty classroom, Mitchell opened his manila envelope and removed documents that Diana immediately recognized as military personnel records. Not her official discharge paperwork, but classified assessments that she'd never seen during her active duty service. Diana, Mitchell began, I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing your actual service record through channels that required special authorization to access. What I found confirms everything you told me and reveals details that make your current situation even more problematic than I initially understood. Diana remained standing at attention, military conditioning overriding civilian casualness as she prepared to receive information that would affect her future. Operation Silent Guardian prevented the deaths of over 800 civilians. Your precision engagement eliminated 3 suicide bombers who were coordinating simultaneous detonation in a complex that included an elementary school, medical clinic, and marketplace. The numbers were larger than Diana had calculated during her original mission briefing. Intelligence assessments conducted after the operation had revealed the full scope of civilian casualties that her actions had prevented. But the political aftermath buried your achievements for reasons that had nothing to do with military effectiveness, Mitchell explained. Iraqi government pressure for reduced American military presence required finding justification for policy changes. Successful special operations contradicted that political narrative. Diana's jaw tightened as she processed the institutional betrayal that had defined her civilian transition. Her heroism had been politically inconvenient, rather than militarily questionable. So the investigation was designed to find problems with your engagement, not validate its success. Your service record was classified not to protect operational security, but to serve diplomatic objectives that treated your achievements as bureaucratic complications.
The systematic nature of the betrayal was worse than Diana had understood. She'd assumed her classification was standard security protocol rather than political cover-up designed to justify policy decisions. Diana, Mitchell said gently, you saved hundreds of children's lives in Iraq, and you've spent 3 years serving children in Phoenix. Both forms of service matter, but only one utilizes capabilities that took years to develop and shouldn't be wasted on minimum wage employment. Diana remained silent, but Mitchell noticed subtle changes in her posture that suggested emotional barriers beginning to crack under the weight of recognition and possibility. I have contact information for 3 organizations that work specifically with veterans whose classified service can't be conventionally documented, Mitchell continued, placing business cards on the desk between them. Private Security Consulting,
tactical training instruction, and veteran advocacy programs that understand the unique challenges you've faced. Diana picked up the business cards, reading names of organizations she'd never heard of, but that apparently understood circumstances she'd thought were unique to her situation. These positions would utilize your specialized training while respecting the classified nature of your operational background, Mitchell explained. Starting salaries range from $75,000 to $120,000 annually, with advancement opportunities based on demonstrated competence rather than conventional credentials. The financial improvement was significant, but Diana realized the psychological implications were more important. Recognition, respect, meaningful work that honored her capabilities rather than ignoring them. "What's the cost?" Diana asked, understanding that opportunities this substantial typically required commitments or compromises that weren't immediately apparent. Mitchell appreciated her caution. Military personnel with classified backgrounds learned to evaluate offers carefully, especially when they seemed too good to represent simple generosity. "Relocation to areas where these organizations operate," Mitchell said. "Background investigations that will verify your service record through appropriate channels, professional references from military personnel who can authenticate your capabilities without revealing classified operational details." Diana understood immediately. Accepting these opportunities meant abandoning the anonymity she'd spent 3 years constructing while trusting new organizations with information about her background that could create complications if mishandled. "You don't have to decide immediately," Mitchell said, "but you deserve to know that alternatives exist to minimum wage invisibility. Your service record justifies opportunities that honor your achievements rather than hiding them." Diana looked through the classroom window at the cafeteria where she'd found purpose serving children who needed protection, even in small ways. The work was meaningful, but Mitchell was right. It didn't utilize capabilities that had taken years to develop and shouldn't be wasted on minimum wage employment. "Commander," she said quietly, 3 years ago I needed anonymity to survive institutional betrayal. I'm not sure whether I need recognition or whether recognition needs me." Mitchell understood the distinction immediately. Diana was questioning whether accepting these opportunities served her healing process or simply satisfied other people's opinions about how military capabilities should be utilized. "That's a decision only you can make," Mitchell replied. "But hiding exceptional abilities doesn't serve anyone's interests, especially when those abilities could help other veterans navigate similar challenges." The suggestion that her experience could benefit others carried weight that purely personal considerations didn't. Military service oriented toward protecting people, and Diana's transition struggles had given her insights that could prevent similar institutional failures. Diana realized she was facing the same choice she'd confronted in Iraq: accept impossible odds to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, or choose personal safety over mission accomplishment. The difference was that this time, the people she could protect were veterans like herself. Diana stared at the business cards for 30 seconds, her military training calculating risks and benefits, while her civilian experience whispered warnings about trusting institutions that had already betrayed her once. But Commander Mitchell's suggestion about helping other veterans carried weight that purely personal considerations couldn't match. "Commander," she said finally, "before I consider these opportunities, I need to understand something. How many other veterans are in situations similar to mine?" Mitchell had anticipated this question. Military personnel with Diana's background rarely thought in purely individual terms. They automatically considered broader implications for others facing similar challenges. Conservative estimates suggest over 400 military personnel with classified service records are currently employed in positions that don't utilize their specialized training, Mitchell replied. Many work minimum wage jobs because their qualifications can't be conventionally verified. The numbers represented systematic failure that extended far beyond Diana's individual circumstances. Hundreds of highly trained veterans were wasting capabilities that had taken years to develop, serving in invisible roles while struggling with civilian transition challenges that existing support systems couldn't address. "What's being done to help them?" Diana asked. "Very little," Mitchell admitted. Classified service creates unique challenges that standard veteran support programs aren't designed to handle. Most organizations require documented proof of military capabilities that these veterans can't provide. Diana understood immediately. The same catch-22 that had trapped her for 3 years was affecting hundreds of other veterans whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but whose skills were desperately needed in appropriate civilian roles. "These organizations you mentioned," Diana said, gesturing toward the business cards, "do they work with other classified veterans, or would I be an isolated case study?" Mitchell smiled, recognizing that Diana was thinking strategically rather than just personally. All 3 organizations were founded by veterans with classified backgrounds who faced similar transition challenges. They specifically recruit personnel whose capabilities can't be conventionally documented. The information shifted Diana's perception from individual opportunity to community connection. Working with organizations that understood classified service complications meant joining networks of people who'd navigated similar challenges rather than explaining her background to civilians who couldn't comprehend its complexity. "Diana," Mitchell continued, "one of these organizations is developing a veteran advocacy program specifically designed to identify and support military personnel whose achievements have been buried for political or security reasons. They need someone with your experience to help design support systems that actually work." The possibility of preventing other veterans from enduring what she'd experienced for 3 years suddenly made the personal risks feel worthwhile. Military service orientation focused on protecting others, and Diana's transition struggles had given her insights that could create systemic improvements. Diana looked through the classroom window at the cafeteria where Helen Wright was directing afternoon cleaning activities with characteristic bureaucratic authority. 3 years of accepting institutional indifference had served a purpose, survival and healing from bureaucratic betrayal, but continued acceptance no longer served anyone's interests. "Commander," Diana said with decision that carried military certainty, "I'll need 2 weeks to transition my responsibilities here appropriately. These children depend on consistent meal service, and I won't abandon that obligation for personal opportunities." Mitchell understood that Diana's concern for the students represented authentic character rather than bureaucratic excuse-making. Military personnel who truly cared about their missions didn't abandon responsibilities without ensuring proper transitions. "Absolutely appropriate," Mitchell replied. "Professional transitions should honor existing commitments while preparing for new responsibilities." Diana picked up the business cards and studied the contact information more carefully. Organizations with names like Classified Transition Services, Strategic Career Solutions, and Veteran Advocacy Network that operated in cities where classified service backgrounds were understood and valued. "These positions," Diana said, "they would involve helping other veterans navigate transition challenges similar to what I've experienced?" "Among other responsibilities," Mitchell confirmed. "Tactical consulting, training instruction, and program development that utilizes your specialized skills while contributing to veteran support systems that actually work." Diana felt familiar military anticipation building as she processed the implications of meaningful work that honored her capabilities while serving others who needed protection. The combination of personal recognition and mission orientation created motivation that minimum wage invisibility had never provided. "I'll need character references from military personnel who can authenticate my capabilities without revealing classified operational details," Diana said, thinking through practical requirements. "Already arranged," Mitchell replied,
producing a folder containing reference letters from Colonel Torres and 2 other senior officers whose security clearances allowed them to verify Diana's competence without compromising operational security. Diana realized that Mitchell had spent considerable time preparing comprehensive support for her transition, suggesting that her case represented more than casual interest in helping an individual veteran. "Commander," she said directly, "why are you investing this much effort in my situation? This goes beyond standard community outreach responsibilities." Mitchell appreciated her directness. Military personnel deserved honest answers to direct questions, especially when they involved significant life decisions. Because institutional failures that waste exceptional capabilities serve nobody's interests. Your skills are needed in roles that matter, and your experience could prevent similar failures for other veterans. Personal waste becomes systemic loss when multiplied across hundreds of cases. Diana understood the broader implications immediately. Her situation represented one example of institutional betrayal that was affecting hundreds of veterans whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but whose capabilities were desperately needed in appropriate civilian roles. "Diana," Mitchell continued, "3 years ago, you made an impossible shot that saved hundreds of civilian lives. Today, you have the opportunity to prevent hundreds of veterans from wasting capabilities that took years to develop. Both missions matter." The parallel between her military service and current opportunity was clear and compelling. Precision engagement in Iraq had protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Veteran advocacy work would protect military personnel who couldn't navigate bureaucratic failures alone. Frank Delacroix appeared in the classroom doorway, his maintenance responsibilities providing legitimate reason for checking on the extended private discussion between Diana and the Navy officer. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Wright is asking about afternoon inventory schedules." Diana recognized the interruption as Frank's way of providing social cover for ending a conversation that had clearly reached significant conclusions. His veteran intuition understood that military discussions sometimes required discrete transitions back to civilian workplace dynamics. "Thank you, Frank," Diana said. Commander Mitchell was explaining veteran support programs that might be relevant to career transitions. Frank nodded with understanding that went beyond the surface explanation. His brother's experience had taught him to recognize moments when veterans faced decisions about reclaiming identities they'd buried for survival. "Commander," Diana said, making her decision final, "I accept your offer to facilitate contact with these organizations. 2 weeks' notice here, then transition to work that utilizes capabilities rather than hiding them." Mitchell felt satisfaction that came from successful mission completion. Connecting exceptional personnel with appropriate opportunities served everyone's interests, Diana's, the military's, and the other veterans who would benefit from her advocacy work. "Diana," he said, 3 years of invisible service ends now. Tomorrow begins work that honors your achievements while helping others navigate similar challenges." As they walked back toward the cafeteria, Diana felt psychological weight lifting that she'd carried since her discharge from active duty. Recognition, respect, and meaningful work that connected her military service to continued mission orientation. Helen Wright intercepted them at the serving line with bureaucratic disapproval that suggested extended personal discussions during work hours violated multiple workplace protocols. "Blake," Helen said sharply, "afternoon cleaning schedules require immediate attention. Personal conversations should be conducted during designated break periods." Diana looked at Helen with an expression that had changed fundamentally during her conversation with Mitchell. 3 years of accepting institutional indifference were ending, replaced by renewed confidence in her actual worth and capabilities. "Mrs. Wright," Diana said with controlled military directness, "I'll be submitting 2 weeks' notice tomorrow morning. This discussion involved career transition planning that affects my employment status here." Helen's expression shifted from bureaucratic authority to confused shock. Cafeteria workers didn't typically receive career counseling from Navy commanders or transition to positions that warranted 2 weeks' professional notice. "I don't understand," Helen said. "You're leaving food service for what kind of position?" Diana smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in 3 years. Veteran advocacy work that utilizes specialized training I haven't been able to discuss until now. Frank observed the exchange with satisfaction that came from watching someone reclaim identity and purpose that had been buried for too long. Military service left marks that civilian employment couldn't erase, and Diana was finally allowing those marks to show. Principal Hayes approached the group, drawn by Helen's obvious distress and the continued presence of a Navy officer whose visits were creating complications he didn't fully understand. "Commander Mitchell," Hayes said carefully, "I trust your veteran outreach program has been productive. Are there implications for our staffing that I should understand?" Mitchell recognized the administrative concern while appreciating the opportunity to provide Diana with institutional support for her transition. "Principal Hayes, Mrs. Blake has been offered opportunities that better utilize her military background and specialized training. These positions serve veteran support programs that benefit entire communities." The diplomatic explanation honored Diana's service while providing Hayes with information that positioned her departure as professional advancement rather than workplace dissatisfaction. Diana realized that her decision to accept meaningful work would create ripple effects that extended beyond her personal circumstances. Other veterans would benefit from advocacy programs she would help develop. Her experience would prevent institutional failures that had wasted her capabilities for 3 years. But most importantly, she would finally be serving in roles that honored her achievements rather than hiding them. 3 years of invisible service were ending. Tomorrow would begin work that mattered.
6 months later, Diana Blake stood before a conference room filled with veterans whose stories mirrored her own. Highly trained military personnel whose classified service records had left them struggling with civilian transitions that existing support systems couldn't address. The Veteran Advocacy Network had grown from a small consulting firm to a comprehensive support organization, and Diana's experience had become the foundation for programs that were changing lives across the country. Today, we're announcing our partnership with 12 private sector organizations that understand the value of classified military experience, Diana said to the assembled group. These companies have committed to hiring practices that authenticate veteran capabilities through military reference networks rather than conventional documentation. The audience included former Navy SEALs working as security guards, ex-Army Rangers employed in warehouse positions, and retired Air Force Special Operations personnel struggling with minimum wage civilian employment. Each represented wasted capabilities that Diana's advocacy work was systematically addressing. Marcus Rivera, a former Marine Force reconnaissance operator who'd been working construction despite advanced tactical training, raised his hand. "Diana, how do we know these opportunities won't disappear when political priorities change? Military personnel with our backgrounds have been burned by institutional promises before." Diana appreciated the question's directness. Veterans with classified service backgrounds had learned to be skeptical of assistance programs that seemed too good to represent sustainable change. "Marcus, these partnerships are built on demonstrated value rather than political goodwill," Diana replied. "Private sector organizations profit when they employ personnel with exceptional capabilities. Market incentives provide more reliable support than bureaucratic policies." The distinction was crucial. Government programs could be eliminated by policy changes, but private sector employment relationships continued as long as they served mutual interests. Frank Delacroix sat in the back row, having driven from Phoenix to attend Diana's first major presentation as Director of Veteran Placement Services. His brother had been among the first veterans placed through Diana's program, transitioning from disability-struggling unemployment to tactical consulting work that utilized his Afghanistan experience. "Diana," Frank called out, "can you tell these folks about the ripple effects? How many families have been impacted by veterans finding appropriate employment?" Diana smiled, recognizing Frank's question as an opportunity to discuss outcomes that extended beyond individual career changes. "Conservative estimates suggest our program has affected over 300 families during the past 6 months. Veterans who transition from minimum wage employment to positions that utilize their specialized training typically see income increases of 200 to 400%, but the psychological benefits often matter more than financial improvements. She gestured toward Maria Santos, a former Army intelligence specialist who'd spent 2 years working retail before finding appropriate civilian employment through the advocacy network. Maria, would you mind sharing your experience? Maria stood with confidence that hadn't existed during her retail employment. 6 months ago, I was folding clothes and explaining store policies to customers who treated me like invisible labor. Today, I'm analyzing security threats for a consulting firm that values the intelligence training I couldn't discuss in civilian interviews. The transformation was visible in Maria's posture, voice, and professional bearing. Meaningful work that honored her capabilities had restored confidence that minimum wage employment had systematically eroded.
But the most important change, Maria continued, is that my daughter sees me as someone who matters. For 2 years, she watched me accept treatment that suggested my military service was irrelevant to civilian success. Now she understands that specialized training has value, even when it can't be conventionally documented. Diana understood the intergenerational implications immediately. Military families often struggled with civilian transitions that failed to acknowledge the value of specialized service. Children learned unhealthy lessons about institutional betrayal when they watched decorated parents accept inappropriate employment. Commander Mitchell entered the conference room as Maria concluded her remarks, his presence representing ongoing military support for veteran advocacy programs that were proving successful where conventional approaches had failed. Diana, Mitchell said, approaching the podium, I have an update that affects everyone in this room. The Department of Defense has authorized development of a classified veteran transition program based on your advocacy model. The announcement generated immediate attention from veterans who'd learned to be skeptical of government programs, but recognized the significance of official military endorsement. This program will provide authentication services that verify classified military capabilities without compromising operational security, Mitchell explained. Veterans with specialized backgrounds will receive documentation that civilian employers can trust without accessing classified information. Diana felt satisfaction that came from systematic change rather than individual success. Her advocacy work had created institutional improvements that would benefit thousands of veterans whose service couldn't be conventionally acknowledged. Commander, asked Sarah Chen, a former Army intelligence officer, will this program address the political factors that created our problems in the first place? Individual solutions don't fix systemic issues. Mitchell appreciated the strategic thinking that military personnel brought to complex problems. Sarah was right that individual assistance programs couldn't address institutional failures that created classified veteran transition challenges. Sarah, the program includes policy recommendations designed to prevent future cases where political considerations override military effectiveness assessments, Mitchell replied. Diana's experience has provided evidence that bureaucratic betrayal wastes capabilities the military spent years developing. The most significant change, Diana said to the group, isn't individual opportunity. It's a cultural shift towards recognizing that classified service creates unique challenges requiring specialized support systems. She gestured toward a wall display showing statistics from their placement program. Over 400 veterans contacted during 6 months of operation, 78% successfully placed in positions that utilized their specialized training. Average income increase of 312%. Family stability improvements documented across multiple metrics. These numbers represent individual lives changed, but they also prove that systematic approaches to classified veteran transitions can work when designed by people who understand the challenges. Frank Delacroix stood to address the group, his civilian perspective providing context that military personnel sometimes missed. Folks, I'm not a veteran, but I watched my brother struggle with transition challenges until Diana's program helped him find appropriate work. What you've built here doesn't just help veterans, it helps communities understand the value of military service that can't be publicly celebrated.
The observation was accurate. Civilian communities often failed to appreciate military capabilities because classified service remained invisible to people who made hiring decisions. Diana, called James Wilson, a former Navy intelligence specialist, what's next for the program? How do we scale this approach to reach veterans who don't know these resources exist? Diana had been anticipating this question. Individual success created responsibility for systematic expansion that could benefit veterans across the country. We're developing regional networks that connect classified veterans with local resources, Diana replied. Military personnel with specialized backgrounds often cluster around major installations where their service occurred. Regional advocacy programs can serve those communities more effectively than centralized approaches. The expansion plan represented Diana's military thinking applied to civilian organizational challenges. Decentralized operations provided resilience and local adaptation that centralized programs couldn't achieve. Principal Hayes appeared in the conference room doorway, having traveled from Phoenix to observe Diana's presentation. 6 months earlier, he'd watched a cafeteria worker submit resignation notice without understanding the significance of her military background. Diana, Hayes said, I wanted to apologize publicly for institutional failures that wasted your capabilities for 3 years. Oakwood Elementary didn't recognize the value of your service, and our loss has become these veterans' gain. The apology was unnecessary but appreciated. Diana understood that civilian institutions often failed to recognize military capabilities because they lacked frameworks for understanding classified service complications. Principal Hayes, those 3 years taught me lessons that conventional military transition programs couldn't provide. Understanding institutional failure from the inside created insights that are helping design better support systems. She turned back to the assembled veterans, seeing faces that reflected hope rather than resignation for the first time in their civilian transitions. 6 months ago, I was serving lunch to elementary school children while hiding capabilities that took years to develop, Diana said. Today, we're creating systems that ensure other veterans don't waste specialized training in inappropriate employment. The transformation was complete, but ongoing. Individual healing had created collective advocacy that was preventing similar institutional failures. Military service teaches us to protect people who can't protect themselves, Diana concluded. Veteran advocacy work continues that mission in civilian contexts where classified service is finally receiving appropriate recognition. As the conference ended and veterans networked with potential employers who understood the value of military capabilities, Diana realized that her story had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become proof that individual courage could create institutional change, one classified veteran at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.